Oftentimes, the best way to achieve success in our ventures is to go beyond what is typical, to challenge ourselves, to accept disagreement, and to disrupt. My name is Matt Abrahams, and I teach strategic communication at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Welcome to Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast. Today, I'm really excited to speak with Ilya Strebulaev. Ilya is the founder of the GSB's Venture Capital Initiative and a professor of private equity and finance. He teaches a popular class on venture capital and has won numerous teaching awards. Along with Alex Dang, he has written the new book, The Venture Mindset, Make Smarter Bets and Achieve Extraordinary Growth. Ilya, thanks for joining me. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Shall we get started?
Absolutely.
Great. Can you describe what you mean by the venture mindset?
Of course. Venture mindset, simply put, is just a new way of thinking, a new mental model, how every leader can, and in many situations should, approach decision-making, to make smarter, quicker decisions, to make decisions in unusual situations, when especially the world is uncertain, when there are a lot of unknowns, when there's disruption. And the reason why it's called venture is because after 20 years of doing research at Stanford on venture capitalists, I realized that for many, many decades, they've been facing very, I would say, hostile environment where they face a lot of failures. They face a lot of uncertainty. And they developed, in order to survive and succeed, a very different mental model, a very different mindset of how they make decisions. And they backed the most successful companies of today's era, from Netflix to Airbnb, from SpaceX to Google. And the way to think like venture capitalists will make you better leader, better decision maker, even if what you do is far, far, far away from the world of venture capitalists and startups.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading the book, and there are many bits of advice and guidance that help anybody who has to make important decisions, especially under uncertainty. And I appreciate the value of the book. You describe venture capitalists as being failure champions. What does this mean, and what lessons can all of us take from this notion?
Let me start with a story.
Yeah.
About 12 years ago, gaming was a very hot topic. In fact, it is a very hot topic today, okay? And at the time, two young entrepreneurs, their names were Stuart Butterfield and Cal Henderson, started a company. They called it Teeny Spec. One of the venture capital firms that invested in them was Accel Partners. It is the venture capital firm that was behind Facebook and many, many other famous startups in the past. And then they developed a game called Glitch. Well, and the truth to be told is the game was very glitchy. It didn't work properly. The fans did not like it. And so sometime late, in fact, very quickly, they realized that's that. Now, they had some money left in the bank, about $5 million. Non-trivial amount of money, Matt. And so they wrote to the investors and they said, you know what, we're going to return you the money. And the investors, including Accel Partners, replied back, we don't want your money. And the reason is because Andrew Bradshaw, who was an Accel partner, who was leading this investment, in his investment memo that when he proposed to invest in Teeny Spec, said, we invest because of the team, because of the founders. They are in it together. We observe them. They failed together. So when I say VCs are failure champions, it means that the real smart venture capitalists and venture-minded people, in fact, not only are not afraid of failure, but they know that in some situations you have to seek constructive failure. Mm-hmm. So Accel decided to proceed with investment. They decided, no, we're not going to we're not going to take the money back. Okay, and Stuart Butterfield and Cal Henderson turned around. There's $5 million or whatever was left, okay, and developed a new game, which turned out to be not a game, but one of the most successful companies around. And maybe, Matt, you're using it. It's called Slack.
Absolutely, I use it every day.
Right. So, but had the venture capitalists not been failure champions, maybe Slack would not have existed.
So this notion of trying new things that might result in failure and then persisting can be really important. We had the good fortune of talking to Amy Edmondson about the opportunities failure provides and how we can lean into failure. So it's not just the willingness to try something new with failure being potential, but it's also learning from that failure and then developing something beyond it.
I think it's what I call swinging for the fences.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying something unusual. It's going for outliers, because at the end of the day, it is outliers, if successful, that are going to determine our future and will make leaders very successful. And there's also a difference between, let's say, a founder failure, so that you bet on people, again, you're mistaken, or the product failure, so that maybe you're a failure champion and you promote people who failed because they've learned from experience. And, venture-minded organizations, when we did research, are pursuing this. So I can give you many examples from Netflix, from Amazon, but also from organizations that are far away from the venture world as well.
I like that distinction between failure in terms of the relationships and people and failure versus the product or goal that you're trying to achieve, and making that distinction is really helpful. You provide several tips for how we can all make better decisions based on what venture capitalists do. Can you provide insight into two of these? The first is using the question, why should we not do this? And the second being encouraging dissent when making decisions. Can you talk about both of those?
Sure. The first one was initially a big surprise to me. So I've been at Stanford for 20 years, and I've been studying for many years how venture capitalists make decisions. And successful venture capitalists, they start with identifying hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of opportunities. Okay? And they call it sourcing. But if you're, Matt, very successful in identifying these thousands of opportunities, you need to find a way to very quickly kind of squeeze them, okay, from thousands into hundreds or maybe ideally dozens. And this is what I observed, that the smartest of venture capitalists ask a very different question from what most of us ask. Let's say I've been working a lot with the executives in large organizations, and they consider all these projects, okay, and budget allocation decisions. And what kind of question they're asking? Why should we invest? So the entire presentations and 100-page decks are built around this. Now, venture capitalists are going to approach every single new opportunity with a very different question, which is why we should not proceed. That means that they're looking for red flags. And if they see a very clear red flag, let's say, for example, the founding team is untrustworthy, let's say, okay, then they will stop. They make a very quick decision not to continue. And this works because this allows them to spend much more effort on opportunities that are potentially much more profitable. And notice that they communicated differently. They communicated differently among themselves, which I think is a critical point. By asking a negative question why we should not, they communicate to each other and, of course, to the founders as well, that they would like to ensure that this decision is efficient, this decision is quick, and this decision is not final, which is when I tell my students, if you meet with a venture capitalist and then the venture capitalist will invite you back it does mean that they want to invest in you. It means that you proceeded to the next stage. Now, important point is that at the next stage, the line of questions changes, what I call from fast lane to slow lane. Now, suddenly, we will be asking different questions. And I think that all of us can take it on board, especially because I believe that we should strive for having more opportunities.
I really like this idea of assuming you will proceed and are looking for the things that require you to stop versus what are all the reasons why we should do something. It's a very different mindset, and I can certainly see how it would drive for efficiency because you're moving faster, you're proceeding, and you're only looking for things that cause you to stop. And I think many of us can apply that in some of the decisions we have to make. The second learning that you suggest in terms of decision making is encouraging dissent. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Of course, in fact, we call one of our chapters in the book Agree to Disagree. Okay, and that is one of the 9 principles that we've discovered when studying venture capitalists and their decision-making processes. What do you mean by agree to disagree? Now, if you've been to any large organization or any group decision-making, then you're very familiar with the typically people's desire to come to a consensus. Okay? You can disagree with somebody, but the point of disagreements typically is to try to settle those disagreements, to find the truth, so to say, okay? And some organizations, it's formal. Maybe we vote and there's going to be a consensus required or unanimity required. In some other organizations, it's more cultural, so that we feel we really have to coalesce around a decision, okay? And in many situations, it works. But the moment it is about disruption, innovation, uncertainty, unpredictability, it doesn't. And what I observed in dozens and dozens of venture capital firms, but also in many venture-minded organizations, that there are rules in place, there are designs that impose this kind of obligation to dissent. Let me give you maybe one example, okay? One of my VC friends, his name is Nagraj Kashyap, and he used to be the head of Qualcomm Ventures, corporate venture fund of Qualcomm, a very, very large company located in San Diego. Now, about 12 years ago, Nagraj and one of his, at the time, junior partners, Patrick Egan, who was based in San Francisco, and another colleague of theirs, Sachin Deshpande, found out a very interesting young startup. Now, that was around 2012 timeframe. The startup was named SaaS-B. SaaS is Software as a Service B, okay? Hardworking kind of B in the software space. They really fell in love with the founder. They thought that the founder was amazingly passionate and very client-oriented, and the prototype that they saw was very impressive, okay? And that was in the kind of telecommunications space, broadly speaking. They went back to San Diego, and what do they have at Qualcomm Ventures? The Investment Committee, IC. And every single other member of the IC told them, this is stupid. This startup has no clients, no sales. The prototype seems not to work seamlessly. And moreover, in that space, there's so many competitors. There's a Cisco with WebEx. There's BlueJeans, okay? There's Skype that was recently bought by Microsoft. I mean, this just does not make sense. Now, that would have been the end of the story. But Nagraj was the head of Qualcomm Ventures, and he designed the process in a way that allowed for a leeway, which is for relatively small checks. There was a seed fund, and you do not need the investment committee approval. So in fact, he designed this agree to disagree mechanism, even though most people were against. If it was sufficiently for one or for two people to be in favor to proceed with a very small investment. And that's what Patrick Egan did. And In fact, it turned out to be that this startup SASB, you've never heard of, but I'm sure you heard about a startup called Zoom. Well, SASB became Zoom, and I think dollar per dollar, that definitely became the most successful investment that Qualcomm Ventures ever made. Now, the point about this is not that Zoom was successful. The point about this is that you have to think about designing the process where those who dissent are encouraged to explain themselves and encouraged to dissent. And so this principle, and in the book we mention many different implementations of this principle. Okay, and it's interesting because I worked with a lot of leaders of large companies. Okay, and very often we go with them through the kind of sundry list that I came up with in my research of how different venture capital firms, different venture capital partnerships decide on designing this agree to disagree system, and sometimes it just clicks. For example, one of the simple mechanisms is juniors always must speak first.
Tell me more about that, because that applies to meetings and one-on-one interactions.
It applies to every single meeting. For example, I think that at Stanford, when I'm on the hiring committee to find new amazing professors, we implemented this rule at some point when we said our junior colleagues speak first in every single recruiting meeting. And I think that is very, very helpful. And I think there are several ideas behind that. One is that, in fact, very often in many organizations, junior people know more because they, in fact, done all the groundwork. But more importantly, I think, is that think about any organization and a very senior person says something maybe negative about an idea or something that junior people will disagree. They, I guess, will think twice whether raise an issue. Okay? Now, and I talk to so many leaders, and they say, yes, it's such an easy to implement idea, and in fact, it's very intuitive. Let me give you another idea, which is counterintuitive. And counterintuitive is that often experts should speak last. Now, in many traditional situations, that's not a good idea. Okay, when we're in the world of incremental, step-by-step changes, experts are the people who should speak, and then there is no point in discussing. But the moment we think about something really swinging for the fences, really uncertain, unusual, maybe kind of world-changing, okay, then experts can be sitting in their cage, and maybe they will meet something that somebody with a fresh eye will see. And so in other organizations I observed, experts that will work on this opportunity, they will share all the materials in advance, but then everybody else will have a say first. So those are just simple items of the long sundry list I have. And I think that encouraging dissent is great, because if you don't, the standard, the normal procedures will discourage dissent.
Right. And it is through dissent that new ideas and innovation come about, that you can find potential pitfalls in advance. I really like these rather simple ideas. Have people who are newer and more novice speak first. Have those who are expert perhaps speak last to allow others that freedom to speak. You're really talking to how we tend to defer to people who are more senior or more expert, and we need to disrupt that. And this notion I really find intriguing of building systems in place that when there is disagreement, that still allows for moving forward without just putting a roadblock up. And we've had several guests, Jeremy Utley being one, who talks about creativity and generating new ideas. And it seems to me that these rules would help generate new ideas and keep things moving rather than stop them. You wrote an article that provided 3 things venture capitalists do that can help all of us get our dream jobs after being laid off. Can you share what those things are and how we can put them into practice in our own lives?
Now, when you're laid off, it's a bad day, and you are searching for a new job, And I think many people, and there's research about this, have the tendency to effectively, take the first job, take the first offer. Okay? And I think it's understandable. But what the venture mindset says is that first, you have to value yourself more. You have to think about this as an opportunity to discover yourself and to level up your abilities. So first is try to say no more often. And there are a lot of opportunities that will come your way. They don't come all at the same time. But I think this power of saying no is very, very valuable. And now, interesting enough, when we go to venture capitalists, they say no 100 times before they make that one investment. I'm not arguing that in our personal life we should say no 100 times, okay? But I think that if you try to say yes to the very first offer that comes along, I think you're going to miss a lot of other opportunities. Another, I think, very important point about the venture capitalists and the venture mindset is that they try to think long term. And long term is important because at the end of the day, this is an opportunity to think about your life and lifetime income or lifetime happiness. So it's an opportunity for you to stand back. And when you think about long term, you level up the conversation, then in fact you will see a lot of other opportunities.
So it seems to me that the ideas you're suggesting are don't necessarily rush to the first thing that comes to you when making decisions or opportunities, especially around your career, and think about the long game where this goes long term, not in the short term. And it's very easy to, in that moment, think, I've got these debts, I have these things I was trying to achieve that are short term. So adopting those principles of being more willing to say no and seeing the long view can be very helpful. I want to change away from your book to talk a little bit about the class you teach. You teach a very popular class. Let us all be students of you for a moment. What are two big takeaways you hope your students have when they leave your class?
So the class I teach, in fact, a couple of classes, but the class that I teach that is very popular indeed is the venture capital class that I could teach with Brian Jacobs, who is a well-known venture capitalist and a founder of a large venture capital firm, Emergence Capital. Takeaways. One takeaway that I think I would love my students to use from the class is the ability to think differently. So whenever we discuss any issues around startups, around founders, around business models, around fundraising, okay, there are so many ways to think differently, to look differently from different angles at the same problem. And some of these ways to think or to look at are much more efficient than others. And I would like to imbue students with this ability. And you know what? I've been really happy because I've been lucky and happy because I keep in touch with so many of my students after they leave the class, after they graduate, after they leave Stanford, and they come back, and very often they say, you know what, this has really helped me. Because there was a situation, and I looked at it completely differently. And I think that's really helped me. And again, I would say that is one of the venture-minded principles, trying to get out of your four walls, get out of your cage, and try to look completely differently at a very, very tough problem. And another one that is, I think both Brian and I care a lot about, I mentioned get outside the four walls, okay? So my co-teacher Brian Jacobs loves telling our students that the right time to build your network was yesterday. But I think an important point about network is just not increasing the number of contacts, but increasing the number of meaningful contacts and diversifying those contacts. And very briefly, I've done this research with an unusual insight, I think. I compared the LinkedIn profiles of venture capitalists with the LinkedIn profiles of corporate innovators. Now, it's not surprising that venture capitalists have more connections on LinkedIn than corporate innovators. Let's say chief innovation officer at a large company. But I think it was much more interesting to observe how diverse the connections of venture capitalists were in different industries, different educational backgrounds, different geographies. And if you look at corporate innovators, not only they had smaller network, but also those networks more homogeneous, similar, the same company, the same university, and so on. So try to diversify your network. In fact, if you happen to have a LinkedIn profile, you know what, Matt, my advice to the viewers, to our listeners, to the audience, is to check right away what is your network, how diverse it is, and build a plan on how to go outside your four walls.
I think that notion of building a network yesterday, one of the biggest advantages you have in making decisions and growing your career is to have a broad network. But this notion to really strategically diversify, I think, is very important. I also like this idea of questioning the way we make decisions and think, and then challenging ourselves to do it differently, for sure. You know, Ilya, when Jenny, our executive producer, and I were talking about this episode, we joked that we should change the name of this particular episode to Drink Fast and Talk Smart. You are a connoisseur of both tea and wine. When we first met to talk about you being a guest, you shared some lovely tea with me. I later learned you were the faculty leader of the Stanford blind tasting wine team. I didn't even know that existed. And when you talk about tea and wine, you use elegant, amazingly descriptive language. What advice do you have for people in the way that they describe the things that they're passionate about? It just permeates from you when you talk about those things. Do you strategically think about that? And what advice would you give to others who are talking about their passions?
Well, Matt, I hope to share a glass of wine with you too, first of all.
Excellent. Would love that.
Not just vintage, aged, old tea. I think I am trying to mix the traditional mindset and the venture mindset. Mm-hmm. When I describe things I'm passionate about, what I mean by this. When I say traditional mindset is using a language that, however beautiful and exquisite, everybody understands. So that you're comfortable, you're familiar with. And then when I say the venture mindset language, I will try to go outside four walls, but also maybe outside the comfort zone. Maybe I'm going to use some terminology or words with some unusual meanings. And the reason I think is that when you mix these things together, you make people comfortable at the same time, and also make them think. And both tea and wine, I view them as mostly the means of convivial communication, convivial conversation. Mm-hmm. And so when you use some unusual words or unusual analogies, that leads to a lot of interesting discussions.
Yeah. I knew you were purposeful in this because it's just enjoyable to listen to you talk about these things. So this notion of using accessible terms and language that people know and then bringing in things that people might not know to really expand not just how they're thinking about whatever it is you're describing, but to also have an experience that gets them excited or interested as well. Before we end, and this has been a delightful conversation, I'd like to ask you some questions. The first one is created just for you, and the other two are similar to what I ask everybody. Are you up for that?
Of course.
So you've written a great book, the Venture Mindset. As an author myself, I know that the writing of a book can change you and the way you perceive things and think of things. I'm curious, how have you changed in your approach to the work you do or the communication and relations you have as a result of writing your book?
This is a great question, Matt. Thank you for asking me. I've changed a lot. Mm-hmm. I've changed a lot, and I think that I'm implementing myself all these every single one of those 9 principles that we identify in the book. Because, yes, I researched them for so many years, okay? But have I ever applied them to myself? Maybe not. Okay, 2 examples. One, you mentioned failure champion. I think I'm much more positive about many failed research projects that I have. And you know what? When you're doing research, I think that serious, successful research cannot proceed without a lot of failures. So from this point of view, I think I have become much more of a failure champion in my own work than I was before. Another example is we mentioned getting outside the 4 walls. So I'm sure that a lot of our viewers travel all the time. Okay, well, I travel all the time. You travel all the time, Matt. So do you know how I used to travel? Well, I used to go to the airport, okay, and I would have earbuds in my ear, so listening to something important. Then I would load myself on the plane, get into my seat, and open the book or maybe an academic article and read. Okay? And I would not talk to anybody. Unless by chance I met somebody whom I already knew. Now, after I worked on this, getting outside the 4 walls and networking, I changed my approach. Whenever I now travel, my goal is to talk to some people whom I don't know, whether it's queuing in the passport line or sitting next to somebody in the plane. For example, just recently I was coming from New York, and we started talking with a person whom I did not know at all in the airport. Turned out to be he is a journalist working in the horse racing industry. He's describing horse racing industry. Okay. And of course, in our book, we have a chapter about the jockeys and the horses. And that led to an amazingly interesting conversation. So I think those are 2 things that I can continue, but those 2 that really had an impact on me.
I always find it fascinating that the work we do to help others through the things we write and the things we produce can have a fundamental impact on us as well. And it's great that you've changed in those ways, and it sounds like you're benefiting from it. I'm curious, for our second question, who is a communicator that you admire and why?
Winston Churchill. If we think about important historical figures, the way he communicated, especially in very tough situations, simple truths, and I think controversial thoughts that everybody understood and everybody was fascinated with, still resonates with me. So I've listened to dozens and dozens of his speeches.
Truly a gifted orator who came from some challenging circumstances in terms of some speech impediment issues. As you said, very controversial, but effective in accomplishing the goals that he had. Final question. What are the first 3 ingredients that go into a successful communication recipe?
Listen, listen, and listen.
Excellent, excellent. Tell me why listening is important, especially from the view of the venture mindset. Where does listening fit into that?
You know, when you hear founders present to venture capitalists, what I find fascinating is not to look at the founders and their decks, but to look at the venture capitalist. They listen very intently, and they really concentrated on the founders. And I think, in fact, by doing so, they communicate and prepare to communicate as well, not only to the founders, but also to their colleagues in their venture capital firms. But more broadly, it is the notion of the venture mindset, is that by doing something that will change the world, you need to understand better everybody's opinion. For example, we talked about dissent and agree to disagree. Well, you can disagree if you understand what others think. And I think that in every single meeting that I'm having, definitely one of my personal implications of writing this book was I'm trying to become a much better listener.
Yeah.
I don't always succeed yet, but I'm on the way there.
My wife certainly keeps me in check on my listening, but this notion of listen first so you can understand others' opinions and then respond is absolutely critical. Ilya, it has been wonderful to chat with you. Thank you for sharing how we, all of us, can learn from what venture capitalists do. And you've produced just an amazing book, The Venture Mindset. Best of luck with this, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much, Matt, for having me.